Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a really fascinating historical puzzle, the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery. You know, we often think of history as just a bunch of isolated events, but really, it's much more like a massive chain reaction of dominoes falling. We're going to look at how the push for westward expansion acted as that very first domino, setting off a huge national crisis that came dangerously close to tearing the United States apart.
Here is our roadmap for today. First up, Texas and westward expansion. Second, causes of the war. Third, we'll look at the outcomes of the conflict. Fourth, the dilemma of slavery. And finally, we'll wrap up with the Compromise of 1850.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Texas and westward expansion, the drive for a slavery empire.
Okay, so it's super important to separate historical claims from actual concrete evidence. For instance, there's a claim made by some historians that the acquisition of Texas was orchestrated largely by slaveholders just to expand an American slavery empire. But let's look at the concrete evidence. Back in 1836, the U.S. actually refused the Texans' request to join the Union as a slave state. The leaders at the time were really worried about the Missouri crisis and completely upsetting the balance of power in the country. Because the U.S. delayed, Texas actually formed an independent republic, the Lone Star Republic, where slavery was completely legal, while before they eventually joined the U.S. later on.
Moving right along to Section 2, Causes of the War, Violence and Expansionism. Take a look at this timeline because it really forms the chronological spine of our cause and effect story today. Notice how incredibly fast this all happens? In 1836, Texas declares independence from Mexico. Just 10 years later, in 1846, the Mexican-American War kicks off. By 1848, the war is completely over, and the U.S. claims a massive amount of territory known as the Mexican Cession. And then just 2 years after that, in 1850, the U.S. is forced to pass the Compromise of 1850 just to keep the country from falling apart. It's literally a rapid-fire chain reaction.
So, what actually lit the match here? Well, our sources point to a few key causes. First off, President James K. Polk's administration was heavily driven by this intensive, almost aggressive expansionism. He oversaw the final details of the annexation of Texas. Next, the U.S. generally held a perception of Mexico as a weak and inferior country, and that really fueled their aggression. And unlike the Louisiana Purchase, which, if you remember, was achieved through peaceful diplomacy with France decades earlier, Americans in Texas and the U.S. government were more than willing to just employ outright violence against Mexico to achieve these expansion goals. Which brings us to Section 3. Outcomes of the conflict. The massive Mexican Cession.
The sheer scale of the land the U.S. acquired is just staggering. The Mexican Cession added nearly half of Mexico's total territory to the United States. This established the U.S.-Mexico border down at the Rio Grande and handed over lands that now make up California, New Mexico, and several other states. The map of the United States was fundamentally, completely changed almost overnight.
All right, time for a quick pause check. Think about this for a second. If the U.S. just won a war and signed a treaty gaining millions of acres of beautiful new land, why wouldn't that bring political peace and celebration at home? Why on earth would gaining all this massive territory cause a domestic nightmare?
Well, here's the immediate reasoning. Because those new lands completely reawakened an incredibly rancorous debate over whether slavery would be barred or allowed to expand into those territories. The very moment that land became American soil, the burning question was, will it be free or will it have slavery? The treaty might have ended the war with Mexico, but it essentially kick-started a political war right inside the United States.
And that takes us to Section 4, the dilemma of slavery, free soil or slave soil. This debate was so severe it actually broke existing political parties right in half. The suggestion that slavery should be barred from the Mexican Cession caused many Northern members to literally pack up and leave the Democratic Party. They created a brand new faction called the Free Soil Party, and they were dedicated specifically to keeping slavery out of the new Western territories.
Here's our second pause check. If Northerners are forming a whole new political party to stop slavery from expanding into the West, how do you think Southern states reacted to those exact same territories?
As you might have guessed, Southern states vigorously defended the expansion of slavery. They felt it was their absolute right to take their enslaved workforce into the newly conquered lands. This uncompromising stance caused a deep, incredibly bitter divide between the North and the South. The fault lines in the United States were totally exposed, and it set the stage for a desperate need for some kind of political solution to keep the country together.
Which perfectly tees up Section 5, the Compromise of 1850, a short-lived peace.
Congress basically argued for months before finally passing the Compromise of 1850. Now, it wasn't just one single rule, it was actually a collection of 5 distinct laws intended to somehow solve the slavery question in all these new territories. Lawmakers really hoped it would fix the nation's problems, but in reality, it ultimately pleased absolutely no one. It was basically a tiny Band-Aid on a deeply infected wound.
Let's zero in on the most controversial part of the whole shebang, the Fugitive Slave Act. This specific law deeply terrified and angered Northerners. Why? Because it made it a federal crime, not just to help an enslaved person escape, but also a crime if you failed to help capture them when asked. It literally forced citizens living in free states to actively participate in the institution of slavery, whether they agreed with it or not.
And this brilliantly shows how the compromise totally backfired. Instead of creating peace, it heightened tensions and sparked massive defiance. Americans, both black and white, openly flaunted the law. They actually increased their support for the Underground Railroad by providing safe houses for freedom seekers. And at the government level, 8 northern states went so far as to pass personal liberty laws that were specifically designed to counteract the effects of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. The compromise didn't end the conflict at all, it just gave it a brand new battlefield.
Let's quickly review the dominoes we've just watched fall here. Step 1. The intense desire for westward expansion and the annexation of Texas. Step 2. That expansion led directly to war with Mexico and massive territorial gains. Step 3. Those very territorial gains immediately ignited a bitter sectional crisis between the North and South over the expansion of slavery, culminating in the highly flawed Compromise of 1850. Each historical event directly knocked down the next one.
History definitely repeats its themes, right? We saw it clearly in the 1840s, but it leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on. How does acquiring new territory or power sometimes create deeper internal divisions within a nation? Think about it. How could getting exactly what you want, like a massive new piece of land, actually be the very thing that tears you apart from the inside? Thanks for hanging out with me on The Explainer today, and I'll catch you next time.